So we're going to start chapters 37 and 38 and talk about a lot of interesting things that took place during this time as we were going into the Great Depression and getting into World War II. The election of 1932 had two different candidates, one from the Democratic Party. They chose Franklin Roosevelt, who actually had served as governor of New York for a while. He pledged a New Deal for the American people: the repeal of prohibition, aid for the unemployed, cuts in government spending. He was going to try to get America back on its feet. Hoover was up for re-election. Republicans told people that nominating a Democrat would only make things worse than what it actually was, even though it probably wasn't a great slogan to go with that as their philosophy. But Franklin Roosevelt probably is going to win this. Historians look at this and say, Republicans were pretty much on their way out. People were losing jobs too fast, and Franklin Roosevelt just had a demeanor about him, a decorum about him that really pushed people to really want to support him. The results in voters' minds, really the only issue was the Great Depression. Democrats carried all but 6 states. Republicans won their states in the Northeast, where a lot of wealth was still located and people were not as affected by the Great Depression just yet. Many socialists abandoned their candidate to vote for Franklin Roosevelt, which kind of makes people a little bit nervous if you're a Franklin Roosevelt fan. And the Democrats also won both houses, so it's pretty much a clean sweep for the Democrats. However, you're going to have a lame duck period. Hoover would stay in office until March of 1933, as the Constitution had stated. So he gets voted out in November of 32 and doesn't get out of office until March of 1933. And they decided to change this policy, and this is where they came up with what they called the lame duck presidency, because he could still make policies. Hoover offered to help Franklin Roosevelt come up with policies, but Franklin Roosevelt declined to his offer because he didn't want to be associated with his policies at all. He figured, when it's a clean slate, that's when I'll come in here and get my stuff done. And when it's my turn, I don't want to share time with anybody else. The 20th Amendment was passed in February of 1933 to get rid of this lame duck policy, and now, as a result, the president takes over on January the 20th. FDR's New Deal. FDR, the person. He was an only child of a wealthy New York family, and he was a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. He followed many of the same steps that Teddy Roosevelt had actually taken: New York legislator, assistant secretary of Navy, and had a lot of experience. He also had a great personality. He was paralyzed by polio in 1921, and he would not allow his disability to stop him. He kept working to regain full mobility in his upper body, though he could never walk unaided by braces, and other times he did use a wheelchair. His greatest strength was his personality, gifts as a speaker, and his ability to work with others and inspire people. The public image of FDR was a great one. Some even had pictures of him in their house. Can you imagine that? You guys might be like, well, we have pictures of Donald Trump in our house. Okay, maybe you do, but that's kind of weird and rare, I'm sure. But people would have a picture of Franklin Roosevelt like on their mantle, on their fireplace. He was seen as like one of them, one of the family. People would pray for him, and then when he starts doing these fireside chats, you'd have this picture, and people would just picture him being right there at their house. And man, he just did an unbelievable job portraying himself to the American people. Most people didn't even realize he had a physical disability, though. They noticed that he limped a little bit, but he didn't really ever want people to see him in a wheelchair, so he did his best to walk with the braces. Eleanor, his wife, changed the office of the First Lady for forever. She traveled all over the world and gave speeches to support Franklin Roosevelt and his policies. Though their marriage was strained, she respected Franklin Roosevelt as president and his policies to help the U.S. She served as the president's social conscience and influenced him to support minorities and the less fortunate. And so it has been, their marriage was a strained one. He cheated on her. I'm sure you guys remember the story from 9th grade that the woman at his bedside when he died was not his wife, but it was the lady that he cheated on with. So definitely not a good look for Franklin Roosevelt, but nonetheless, his wife was an unbelievable first lady and just did an awesome job supporting him and his policies. The New Deal philosophy, the three R's: relief for people out of work, recovery for business, and reform for the economy. This would guide us through the Depression. His brain trust, he relied on a group of advisors to help him forge a plan to help the U.S. through the Great Depression. One of the groups that helped him were a group of university professors known as his brain trust. FDR also appointed many diverse individuals to help him than any other administration before it. He hired African Americans, women. We talked about Frances Perkins in the Department of Labor. He hired Jews. He hired Catholics. It didn't matter to him. He wanted anybody's help. And he felt like the more diverse his people group that he reached out to was, the better it would look for him in the voting constituencies. Again, he's a master communicator, really understood people, and that was going to be a big deal. So, under the New Deal, the three R's, you definitely want to make sure you know relief, recovery, reform. I would highlight those. His first 100 days. FDR called on Congress into a 100-day session to get legislation passed. During this period, Congress passed into law every request for Franklin Roosevelt. They passed more legislation than any single Congress in history. It's unbelievable at how fast he got this thing rolling. The first thing he did is declare a bank holiday. Over 5,000 banks had failed by 1933. So, to restore confidence in those banks, the president ordered the banks to close for a bank holiday. He then went on the radio and assured that the banks would be reopened after allowing enough time to allow themselves to reorganize and for the government to make sure that they were on a sound, solid basis. And then they could reopen at that point in time. Now, as they try to do this, it is going to take a couple days, maybe even a week or so. But therefore, you could get the banks to kind of at least have a little bit of a breathing room. The next thing he did was he repealed prohibition. He kept his promise on this. This would help get much needed tax money for the government and hope that this might stimulate the economy. And it did a little bit. Fireside chats. FDR would present many talks to the people and to assure them work was being done to help the economy recover. The public would respond by depositing money into the banks. He kept telling people the safest place for your money is in the banks. It's not in a mattress. It's not in a wall. It's not in a hole in the ground. It's at the banks. But he's going to have to come up with something to create, people believing and trusting that the banks were ready to go. So, as he decides to get people to listen to his fireside chats, he passes the Emergency Banking Relief Act. This helped determine what banks were solvent enough to reopen. Then they passed the Glass-Steagall Act. It increased regulation of the banks and limited how banks could invest customers' money. They couldn't just invest it whatever way they wanted. They had to have some type of practice and policy. With this, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, guaranteed individual bank deposits. The gold standard was restricted to international transactions, and Americans could no longer exchange their dollars for gold. Eventually, the U.S. would go off the gold standard to halt high deflation. Now, I would go back, and if you notice I bolded the FDIC, you need to know that because this is the reason why he told people to trust a bank. Basically saying that your money was going to be insured up to a certain amount of money, and therefore you would be solid if you trusted the banks and put your money in the banks. He passed the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC. This provided refinancing of small homes to prevent foreclosures, and so therefore they would help you be able to get a loan. He created the Farm Credit Administration, provided low-interest farm loans and mortgages to prevent foreclosures of indebted farmers. He created FARA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, offered grants to states and local governments that were operating soup kitchens and other forms of relief for the jobless and the homeless. The director was Harry Hopkins of FARA, who was a very close friend of FDR. The Public Works Administration, the PWA, led by Harold Ickes, one of the best names in American history, Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of Interior. And he allotted money to state and local governments for building roads, bridges, dams, and other public works projects. This was a source of thousands of jobs during this time. Again, this is all the stuff doing in the first 100 days. I'll go through and tell you which would be some super important ones to know. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, employed young men on projects on federal lands and paid families a small monthly sum. These guys would work, and they would work at like these camps almost, and the money would get sent home to the families. The Tennessee Valley Authority, the government corporation that hired thousands in one of the poorest regions of the United States. They were to build dams, operate electric power plants, control flooding, and control erosion. The TVA would then sell electricity to that region at lower rates than a previous private company did. Now, the reason why I have socialist program is a lot of people felt like this was socialism because the government is now involved in getting people electricity and giving people power. And they're in control of an industry, and they're making money off of people, and people didn't feel like that was necessarily the right thing to do. The National Recovery Administration, the NRA, they worked with many industry leaders to set codes for wages, hours, levels of production, and prices. This also gave workers the right to organize and collectively bargain, meaning they could tell the bosses what they want. The symbol was a blue eagle, and their motto was, "We do our part." This is eventually declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in Schechter versus the United States. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, this encouraged farmers to reduce production, hopefully boosting prices by paying government subsidies for every acre they plowed under. Also eventually declared unconstitutional, but in theory this was the act that paid farmers not to farm. The Civil Works Administration, that was the CWA. This added to the PWA to help create jobs by hiring laborers for construction projects sponsored by the federal government, CWA. And then you have the Securities Exchange Commission. This is still around today. This created a to regulate the stock market and place strict limits on the kind of speculative practices that led to the Wall Street crash. The commission is still around and protects investors from fraud and insider trading. And then lastly, the Federal Housing Administration gave both construction industry and home building industry a boost by ensuring bank loans for new buildings. You can still get an FHA loan today. Now, which ones are really important here? I would go back to the bank holiday, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the HOLC, FARA, the CCC, the TVA. This part, the NRA, set codes and wages, that's important. The AAA is important. CWA, not as much. SEC, yes, and Federal Housing Administration. So that'll get you through this first part, and we'll pick up on the second New Deal later.